All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be waiting a couple minutes before we start.
And if everybody could turn on their cameras with the help of Daphne, it'd be nice to kind of create a virtual community or a sense of a virtual community. We can see everybody.
We're going to go ahead and promote attendees to panelists. Please accept our invitation so that you can turn on your cameras and participate in the Q&A portion of the lecture. Thank you.
And I'm going to introduce you, and Daphne is going to take over because I'm running to a meeting.
You're running to where?
I'm running to a meeting.
Okay.
Yeah. Busy times.
I'm a panelist?
Yeah, the title of your talk is, okay. No, we're promoting everybody to panelists so we can see everybody. Please turn on your cameras. Hey, Mark, Daniel, I see you.
Well, Isabella's an old friend of mine, right, Isabella? I don't hear you, Isabella. You're on mute, Isabella, dear.
Good to see you, Jay. Yeah, if we're going to see your face, I'm glad you're here.
Oh, I have a camera around here. I'm not sure anybody wants to see my face.
Okay.
But the name should ring a bell, right?
Yeah. Tell people, because people may not know.
My name is Jay Bayless. My grandfather was Mendel Bayless, who was the last person who was accused, put on trial, the last person tried, accused of blood libel exactly 110 years ago in Tsarist Russia before the revolution. It was a worldwide case that rocked the world at the time. It's not very well known right now, but just like Jews left Europe after Kristallnacht from Austria and Germany, they left all over Europe. From all over Europe after the trial. I've met hundreds, literally hundreds over the years. I've lectured all over the world about the story. I've been to Moscow. I've been to Kiev.
Yeah,
but
it's
I don't want to monopolize anybody else's time. But thank you, Isabella, for the introduction. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the Mendel-Bayless trial is certainly among Russian Jews. It's very well known and remembered.
I see a couple of people shaking their heads, so I guess people do know know the story.
Nice
And 2 weeks after the trial, Sholem Aleichem went to visit him in his house and told him the weight of 12 million Jews were on his shoulders for every day he was in prison. And we know what happened to half of them. And that's what I'm most proud of, me being the grandson, is the number of people that left all over Europe after the trial. But again, I don't want to monopolize your time. But it's an important point to make.
Nice to hear you, Jay. So we're going to start in a couple of minutes. If people want to turn on their cameras, Daphne will promote you. It'd be nice to see everybody. Hello, Daniel.
I do have a camera here. So,
and I think if you can mute the attendees, Daphne, it'd be good, and we'll start.
Yep.
And turn on Isabella and Ellen's speakers. Okay. So everybody, welcome to the seminar. Today we have two incredible scholars and scholars who use their intellect, knowledge, and wisdom in the real world, fighting anti-Semitism and sort of unmasking it and decoding it and assessing it. So we have our first speaker will be Izabella Tabarovksy. Izabella is a senior advisor at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. And she also writes for Tablet Magazine and many other journals and papers around the world. Her research focuses on Soviet anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and contemporary left-wing anti-Semitism. She's written and worked on Soviet Jewry, the Holocaust in the USSR, and the like. She was a Carnegie Endowed. She was working with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Harvard University's Kennedy School, and Cambridge Energy Research Associates. She's worked for PBS, and she's worked around the news on news outlets around the world. We also have Ellen Kennan. Ellen is also a senior research fellow at ISGAP, and she's a professor of political science and Jewish studies at Northeastern Illinois University. She's on the board of the American Jewish Committee representing Chicago, very active in the Jewish community and on issues dealing with education, anti-Semitism, and human rights. She was a fellow at our Oxford program as well over the years. She's written widely on issues dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism and security studies. So two prominent and illustrious intellectuals and thinkers, and it's an honor for us to have you here with us. Today they're going to be speaking on issues of Soviet anti-Semitism, which may not be obvious to many of us, dealing with radical Islam and Hamas and Iran and Qatar and the students on campus and the intellectuals signing petitions justifying the decolonization of Jewish people in the pogrom. These are our finest intellectuals. But as you'll hear today, the old Soviet left-wing communist tropes that permeated the Arab world is now tragically repackaged and relevant in the current context. So to have two amazing experts on these issues will really help us to understand what we're getting hit by. So I'll turn to the two of you, and you guys could decide who should go first. And I'm actually going to have to step out of this Zoom shortly, and Daphne will do the Q&A. She'll moderate the Q&A with you. So welcome everybody, and Ellen and Izabella, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to, we've agreed, Ellen and I decided that I'll go through some of the historical part, but what I also want to do, and because we only get 20 minutes each, and then we do the Q&A, but in the introductory remarks, I'll look, I mean, there's a lot to be said. I want to go through it quickly and then spend more time looking at some of the images, because I find that the images that we see today, and compare them to some of the images that came out of the Soviet Union, because I think that images usually really help us understand things much better than just words. So why are we talking about this issue of Soviet anti-Zionism today? What makes it so relevant? And that's because today's left, anti-Israel left, recreates with extraordinary fidelity the tropes, the motifs, and the explanatory logic of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda campaigns, in particular the late Soviet propaganda campaigns that began in '67 and then continued through the end of the Soviet Union. So virtually everything that we hear today, equating Zionism with racism and fascism, equating Israel with calling Israel a settler colonial or apartheid state, or talking even about Israel conducting a genocide on the Palestinian people, referring to the Palestinian terrorism as resistance. All of it appears in Soviet propaganda literature in the 1970s and 80s. And if you grew up at that time, or were kind of an adult at that time, then you would recognize this language. It's important to understand this history, because if we don't understand it, we might think that the things we're hearing today are some kind of an organic product of campus activism, that a few well-wishing idealistic activists got together and decided that Zionism is racism. Well, that's not the case. I mean, when you understand this history, you really understand that this rhetoric is a product of intentional design by propaganda professionals and state security professionals, by the KGB. And that puts it in a whole separate league. If we don't know this history also, we might actually believe that anti-Zionism is not the same as anti-Semitism. But when you know this history, you understand that even though in theory they don't have to be the same, in practice they virtually always are. And we know it as from the effect that this rhetoric had on Soviet Jews. It's well known that Soviet Jews were oppressed, that they suffered professional and educational limitations, that they couldn't travel, they were always under suspicion as potential recruits for the Mossad and other intelligence agencies. And all of that, and at the same time, however, anti-Semitism was actually prohibited in the USSR constitutionally. Anti-Semitic rhetoric was prohibited. So all of the anti-Semitic actions that you saw in the Soviet Union happened under the banner of anti-Zionist rhetoric, precisely the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing today. So what we're dealing with today is really what's important. The point that I want to really for people to understand is demonization. And again, if you understand Soviet anti-Zionism, you begin to understand, you know, that it's not criticism, right? There's a difference between criticism and demonization. What we're dealing with when we're hearing this propaganda is demonization. So I'll get to it in a moment. But I'll just like blow through the history very quickly. So first of all, Soviet anti-Zionism begins with the very early years of Bolshevism. And in fact, it's very natural for the left to be against Zionism. It's very natural for theoretical reasons, grounded in Marxism. During the Bolshevik Revolution, there were also practical reasons. Lenin and Stalin both felt that, and all of the Bolshevik elite thought that Zionists are pulling the Jews or the Jewish poor away from the revolutionary struggle, and so therefore naturally they were against it. So that was there already from the very beginning. So then Stalin adds to it. I'm going very quickly. It's very hard for me to skip through these big chunks of history, but I have to. So Stalin adds to this anti-Zionism conspiracist tropes. So the early Soviet anti-Zionism was, it was grounded in Marxism, but it wasn't particularly conspirological. It wasn't conspiracist. When you get to Stalin, you start to get some of the conspiracist tropes in it. So all of the Stalin post-war anti-Semitic campaigns, which I'm not going to, they're very well researched. You can go online and look for them. But the Doctor's Plot, the Anti-Cosmopolitan campaign, all of that contained accusations of anti-Zionism. And at that point, you start to get the picture of Zionism being this massive force, global force that's very dangerous. It's dangerous. It threatens socialism. It threatens socialist countries, and it needs to be dealt with. So it grows from just kind of a local movement that's really pertinent to one group of people, which is Jews, to this global idea. And at that point, it sort of starts to be viewed as Moscow's biggest enemy. But the real turning point that's really relevant for us comes in 1967. In 1967, what happens then is, of course, Israel wins in the Six-Day War, and that creates a massive crisis inside the Soviet Union and inside the socialist bloc. Why? Because Moscow supported and trained and financed the Arab countries that attacked Israel. And so now Moscow is, they're asking themselves, well, how is it that Israel won? Israel is so small. How could it have won against these countries that we trained? And they start to think about how to explain it and also how to deal with it. And they come up with the idea, and I really believe it was sort of sincere in the sense that, the Soviet political culture was anyway very conspiracist. And so they start to look at the United States, and they see Jews everywhere, and they say, well, there are Jews who support Israel, and they obviously have a role in the Cold War, and they played a role in our loss, in our allies' loss. They start to connect the dots. They look at what's happening to the Jews inside the country, and there is a movement that begins at the time inside the country of Soviet Jews demanding to emigrate. They look at Jews in America who are supporting Jews in the Soviet Union and supporting their demand for emigration. And they connect all of it. And they say, well, there is this evil Zionist ideology that's guiding all of it. And so this is kind of the beginning. And essentially, again, skipping pretty quickly through the story, a bunch of ideologues appear who we now know were anti-Semitic themselves. They were not left-wing in any way. They themselves held very kind of neo-Nazi fascist views. And they put together this kind of worldview that explains everything through Zionist malevolent influence. And essentially, when you look at it, you understand that it's filled with the same tropes that we see in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? So the protocols talk about the dangerous international Jewry, which wants to subjugate the entire world to it. Soviet propaganda talks about international Zionism, which wants to do the same. The protocols talk about Jews controlling politics and banks and money and etc. And Soviet propaganda talks about Zionists doing the same. So there's a correspondence in specific tropes, and there is correspondence also in the defense. So today we often hear anti-Zionists say, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist. And that's something that you see in Soviet literature. Practically every article, every book, every piece of propaganda that they put out contains this line. And they would say that Zionists try to deflect attention from the criticism of the state of Israel by accusing others of anti-Semitism. Again, it's something that we hear today. So again, because they view Zionism as this malevolent global ideology, they direct the propaganda also globally. So via news items, they had a massive apparatus, right, in virtually every country under the sun. They translate their materials into dozens of languages. So it's news items, it's books, it's direct work with left-wing parties, with the developing world. As you know, Mahmoud Abbas, as you probably know, defended his dissertation in the Soviet Union. It's one of the examples of how this I'll talk about it a little bit when we get to the slides. It's one of the ways in which this Soviet propagandist propaganda about Israel and Zionism begins to flow to other countries. And so, this is when, so there's propaganda, and then there is active measures. So working specifically, actively with groups via Soviet embassies, via various front organizations, specifically directly working with groups to inculcate these ideas. And so, and of course, there were other influences on the left as well. But this is one that I think had a really important influence in terms of communicating specific rhetoric, because the similarity is almost 100%, and it's obvious that people wouldn't have reinvented it from the beginning. And I think my understanding, or my kind of theory, is that this rhetoric became part of the global left-wing discourse in the 70s and 80s, or among portions of the left, I should say, right? Not all of the left. The left is very diverse, but portions of the left, particularly the far left, assumes this rhetoric, and it remains there. And essentially, it's part of the package. When you join the left today, you assume this cause, you assume what they call the pro-Palestinian cause, and you assume this whole rhetoric with it. Okay, so I want us to look now at some images so that hopefully it can make some of the things more clear. All right, so I'm gonna, share screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Should, okay. So I want to see if I can do a slideshow. Just a second, slideshow. Okay, from the beginning. All right. Okay, so I want to show you a few images that will compare something that we see today, literally something that we've seen in the last few weeks, with something that we see in the USSR. So this is, first of all, this is kind of a general image. So I want to talk about a lot of what I want to show you first relates to the idea of demonization. I think it's really important that we understand it, because demonization of Jews is really the fundamental aspect of anti-Semitism. And demonization always leads to dehumanization, and dehumanization, as we know from genocide studies, is a precursor to violence against the group that's being demonized, right? Now, if you, in the pre-socialist world, the devil was the worst, the representation of all things evil. When you're speaking to the left, which a lot of it is secular or atheist, you don't talk about the devil. You talk about Nazis, because Nazis are really the biggest devil for the left. And this is certainly for the USSR, which was not just secular but atheist, right? Militantly so. And because of the Soviet role in fighting Hitler, Nazism is essentially the new devil. So when you compare Zionists with Zionism with Nazism, you're essentially demonizing Zionists. Now, of course, Zionists are Jews, right? So you're back to that trope of demonization. So on the left, you have the placard that we simply often see. It's kind of a generic placard that appears in anti-Israel demonstrations. The one on the right is from one of the big London marches that we saw over the last couple of weeks, or over the last few weeks since October 7th. Zionism is the new Nazism. Hold on. But look, I mean, when you look at the picture on the left, this cartoon, this is from 1971, right? So this is already, like, you start, one of the ways in which Zionism and Nazism are kind of equalized is by melding the Star of David with the swastika. And look, already in 1971, the Soviets were doing it. This cartoon comes from a from a Soviet newspaper that appears in 1971. On the right, you have a picture of the table of the British Communist Party. So you see that they have this brochure on Zionism where the swastika is intertwined with the Star of David. This is this brochure. So it says, the cover says, Zionism, a racist, anti-Semitic, and reactionary tool of imperialism. It's a completely Soviet language. And you see this intertwining of the swastika and the Star of David. This is another image that you very often, it's a contemporary image. You will often see it today at various demonstrations. And you can, in fact, you can see, so on this slide on the left, I think it's just another picture of the same table. But on the right, this is from one of the London demonstrations. It says, Israel is a bastard state. And you see, I don't know if you can see it well, but this flag they've added a little kind of personal touch there of an Israeli soldier shooting an Arab woman and child. So this is something that's very, very common. This is another aspect of demonization. And of course, so you equate Israelis and Israeli soldiers with the Nazis. And then you also say that the Israelis are doing to Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews. Again, this is something that we saw in Soviet propaganda already in the 60s and 70s and all the way into the 80s. So I'll go over the cartoon on the left. So this appeared in a Soviet publication in 1967. You can see it's just a couple of months after the Six-Day War. So for those who don't read Russian, what you have here is an Israeli soldier who's holding a weapon, and on the weapon it says Blitzkrieg, which of course is a reference to the Nazi initial attack against the Soviet Union. Every Soviet citizen would have known what this is about. In the back, you see a sign that's kind of in the shape of the Israeli flag, and the words there say Lebensraum, or the life space, basically, right? Which is kind of the purported reason for which the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. And why are they saying it? So they used to say all the time that in 1967, Israel attempted to expand its Lebensraum, to the territories, and so that gives them the basis for the comparison. Now, the soldier is meeting a Nazi ghost, and the Nazi ghost is holding, kind of passing on the assortment of all the deadly tools to the Israeli, and it's showing him a blueprint called the New Order, Model Auschwitz. So the idea is clear, right? The Israelis are replicating concentration camps in the Palestinian territories, and that's something that we, of course, hear all the time today on the left, right? Gaza is essentially a concentration camp, and I'm going to show you a few pictures. So the picture on the right won the first prize in Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest in 2005. Pretty clear here, right? The image of Auschwitz. Israelis are building Auschwitz out of Temple Mount. Here's another picture. This is from the London demonstrations. So the nice lady on the left says, "Stop the Zionist New World Order," right? We just saw that sign in the Russian cartoon in 1967. And here is a nice British lady wearing this sweatshirt in 2023. And then on the right, also from a London march, "Welcome to Gaza," twinned, right? Is that what it says? I have it blocked here. Yeah, twinned with Auschwitz. Okay. So same idea. Let's see. Okay, another kind of another few cartoons with this idea of Israelis being the inheriting the job of the Nazis. So on the left, you have two Soviet cartoons. One is you have an Israeli soldier who's kind of dreaming of Hitler, right? Hitler's face inside the Star of David. And then next to it, you have a picture of, it's purported to be in a museum, you know, an Israeli, so the Nazi soldier is in a frame, in a picture frame, and the Israeli is real, right? The Israeli is in this life reproducing the posture and the ideas, like the destruction that the Nazis had inflicted on the Jews. So the Israeli is doing it against the Palestinians. And, you know, in both of these pictures, you can kind of see how the Nazis are almost like they're not real, right? That Hitler in the Star of David almost looks cute, right? He's kind of this cute, smiley little Hitler, and he's not real. The Nazi in the picture frame is also not real. What's real is the Israeli, you know, with the weapon that's dripping with blood, with the fires behind him, etc. And on the right, you have a picture, a cartoon by Carlos Latouf. I think pretty clear here, Israelis actually wearing Nazi uniform. The tank, Israeli tank, leaving a swastika imprint or shadow, and a Palestinian girl wearing the kind of Auschwitz striped uniform. Here you have, this is, you know, there's some sort of a style of pictures that are kind of like reflections, you know, reflections. The Jew reflects, or the Israeli reflects a Hitler or a Nazi. So on the left, you have a picture. This is actually an interesting cartoon because it's one of the Soviets were always very careful to talk about, to indicate in the pictures that it's an Israeli. Because they were very, very conscious, you know, that if they talked about Jews, they would be accused of anti-Semitism. And they always were, because actually what's interesting is that during the Cold War, you know, the American Jewish community and Americans in general understood that this kind of anti-Zionist propaganda was the same as anti-Semitism. It's only today that we're so confused about it. During the Cold War, people understood it. But still, the Soviets were very careful to make sure that they're showing a Jew who is an Israeli. Well, this is one cartoon on the left where they forgot to do it. So it's actually a Jew. It's a very anti-Semitic image of a Jew too, right? It's a Jew with a horn holding an axe with the Star of David on it, and his shadow is reflected as Hitler. And you always see this kind of correspondence, right, between the Star of David and the swastika. In the middle, you have a cartoon that appeared in the Iran's Holocaust cartoon context. An Orthodox Jew looks into a mirror and sees Hitler. So this is just a pure anti-Semitic image. I mean, all of them are, right? But it's like, it's not even a pretense that you're talking about Zionists. And now the one on the right, and then the next few images I'm going to show, they're from the two London marches. So here you have two guys with a placard that says the irony of becoming what you hated. So Netanyahu is equated with Hitler. Then you have Netanyahu, Hitler would be proud. On the right, stop doing what Hitler did to you. And in the middle, you have Netanyahu with Hitler kind of mustache. Genocide is not political. Okay. Yeah, this is another, this one is actually from 2021, I think. So from May of 21. Again, you know, you see the image, Israeli looks into the mirror and sees and acts as a Nazi. This is one that somebody posted in response to something that I wrote on Twitter, literally very, very fresh. You know, an Israeli, presumably an Israeli soldier looking like Hitler. You know, you have, look at the flag, you know, instead of the Star of David, it's the colors of the Israeli flag, but instead of the Star of David, we have a swastika. I'm going to skip through this. Okay, so that's demonization. There is another aspect to it, and that's of this propaganda, and that's delegitimization, right? It's trying to delegitimize, it's spelled incorrectly, to delegitimize Israel as a state. And this brings me to Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation. So he defended his dissertation in 1982 in the Soviet Union. He used, you can see it in the footnotes, that he relied on Soviet propaganda to kind of as sources for his dissertation. And the dissertation was equating the Nazi Zionists in Israel with Nazi Germany. When you read it, you understand this is a cover of a book that he wrote based on his dissertation. When you read the dissertation, of which there's actually only 19 pages are available publicly, and it's a summary of the dissertation, so you can glean a lot from it. I wrote a piece about it for Tablet. So you can see that his goal really is to delegitimize Israel, to say that Israel is like Nazi Germany, and therefore, you know, there is an original sin there. And so there is no, like, we can't, it's incorrigible. There's nothing we can do with Israel, right? There is only, like, the one road is essentially to eliminate it. He doesn't say it, but that's the idea. You know, and here I'll just show you a few more pictures, and I'm going to wrap up and let Ellen take it from here. So these are just from contemporary images. I don't have corresponding Soviet images, but these are, you know, these are corresponding slogans. So Israel equals racism and genocide. Again, what is the idea? Why do we equate Israel with racism and genocide? Because just like Nazism, these represent sort of different aspects of evil, right? So if Israel equates with racism and genocide, it means that it's an illegitimate state, right? So just like the picture on the right says, Israel is a bastard state, right? So the idea is to delegitimize and to say that Israel has no right to exist. And Israeli apartheid, again, the same idea, right? If Israel is an apartheid state, well, we need to end it, right? It has no right to exist, or at least it has no right to exist as it is. And a couple more, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You know, people have asked me recently whether that too is a Soviet slogan. I can't think of an equivalent. And I think that this actually is an English language equation, because an English language invention, because there is a rhyme here. You know, and I should say also, it's very interesting, is that the Soviets actually never openly said that they wanted for Israel to not exist. They would specifically, as a matter of policy in diplomatic circles, you know, in diplomatic pronouncements, they would say that Israel, of course, has a right to exist, but, right? And then the but is the part where this needs to change and that needs to change. The Zionist regime needs to end. They would say, well, we're not against the Israeli people. We're just against the Zionist regime that runs them. So we need to end the Zionist regime, and then everything will be fine. Oops, sorry. Technology. So they would actually urge their Palestinian, you know, they had a very close relationship with various Palestinian groups, with the PLO and with PFLP, and they would actually urge them to not say that they want Israel eliminated. However, you know, even though they were rhetorically more cautious than even today's left, they sponsored all the groups that wanted to eliminate Israel. They financed all of the regimes that wanted to eliminate Israel. So it was really only, I would say, lip service. Okay. So a couple more points I will make, and then we'll go to Ellen. So the thing that I think is really important to understand, it becomes very clear if you look very closely at the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. When you look at the sources of this propaganda, I already mentioned it, but I think it's really important to understand that it's grounded in conspiracy theory. So what we're dealing with today, in vast majority of cases, is an anti-Zionist conspiracy theory. The idea that Zionists rule the world and they're so evil and they control everything and they're malicious and they try to undermine all the good people of the world. So this is important because, you know, once you're in the conspiracy theory realm, it's not even a question. It is, of course, anti-Semitic. It's the same tropes, you know. The literature, academic literature on conspiracy theory essentially suggests that all conspiracy theory, even the kind that's not overtly about Jews, ends up having anti-Semitic strands in it. And here, this is clearly, we're dealing with an anti-Zionist conspiracy theory that's grounded in obvious anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And one other point that I already made is that criticism is not demonization. And I think it's something that people constantly conflate these two ideas. And I think that we need to be pointing out to people, including to newspapers, when they will call Ilhan Omar a critic of Israel or Rashida Tlaib a critic of Israel. Well, they don't criticize, they demonize. And I think it's really, really important to understand the difference. So I'll stop here and we can talk more in the Q&A. And Ellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. And you are terrific. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. Before I begin, I want to send special regards to one of my favorite people who was on watching us, and that's Linda Sager. Thank you so much for joining us, Linda, a dear, dear friend. I'm a university professor for nearly 50 years. And in that time, we have seen the transformation of university education in a way that is not healthy for democracy and is not healthy for the Jewish world and is not healthy for an investment in what people thought would be an objective, empirical, seeking truth, and critical thinking. Instead, what we are seeing today is a very dangerous sign of the values that Izabella has so brilliantly discussed with us are now institutionalized within the canons of teaching higher education. My research is about something that has not received much attention in our studies of anti-Semitism. And that is, how is the institution of higher education used to promote anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And the reason I'm so interested in this is not only because of the difficulties those of us who are at the universities are experiencing dreadful accusations, which reflect us as a community of being non-feeling murderers that have no business to support Israel. And the reason that I'm so interested in this is I began to study what is the role of the Soviet higher education system in developing this canon of using higher education to control the population and specifically to control the lives of Jews. And that is where I would like to start. Where I am going with this is often we think that because the visions and the visibles of Soviet understanding of how to use very, very powerful signals that can elicit feelings in people that come from the Soviet Union, we often believe, and I believe that I have a different take on this, that what we're watching today is the absorption of Soviet anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism into the American system. And I would like to argue, when I conclude, is that it took a different path. It wasn't a direct absorption, but in 1955, something happens that is very big. There is a meeting called the Bandung Conference in 1955 for the Asian and African nations that are not aligned. These people are very, very much interested in, one, utilizing the kind of monetary support and arms that the Soviet Union can give, but they have a different understanding of what their ideology is. And it is part of third worldism and also national liberation movements. And as early as 1955 through 65, before the 67 victory that explodes in very, very serious propaganda against Israel and Jews, what we find is in American organizations, including SNCC, CORE, SDS, that the issue of supporting Palestine is alive. In fact, it's not only alive, but what is so fascinating in the Black Panther literature from the 50s all the way through 70, they use the exact same cartoons that you have seen, except it is against, Jews are against the African Americans, that Jews are part of an ethos that they supported South Africa, and it shows a commitment to the wrong side of history. So for every cartoon that is shown, what we have is either the duplicate or similar cartoons by the radical left that is eventually going to be called the radical left. And rather than anti-Semitism being the fulcrum for them, as I'm going to argue, what they are using is a language that is essential to today's university students. It is the language of human rights. It is the language of occupation being sinful. It is the language of the universality of suffering and the importance of us joining a cadre of the suffering in order to make a commitment to a universal liberation against capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, but it is transferred specifically to the American context and not to the European context. And I think that when I am teaching, it is very, very serious, the opposition towards Zionism that is largely coming from that era in third worldism and in the area of liberation movements. So I'm going to start with how did Lenin and how did Stalin understand that they could utilize higher education as a system of control and as a system of ideological indoctrination. And that is exactly what Lenin and Stalin do. Often, Lenin is perceived, I believe incorrectly, on the one hand, not as horrific a dictator as Stalin is, but he is somehow legitimized as someone who is a revolutionary that has to do certain things in order for the revolution to bear fruition. And so he develops kind of a thought piece in which we have the translation of it in his memoirs about what education means to him. And he says the following: as a committed revolutionary, I do not develop what might be called a theory of education, but I offer not only any treatise especially, but instead an ideological justification for the indoctrination through education of the masses. For I believe that political ideology should be controlling educational institutions in order to secure the gradual internalization of the masses to think a certain way. And what he says is that he believes that because of that, that education has to do the following. And when he lists this, he basically is listing what we are currently faced with in the United States higher education classroom. And let's take a look at the variables that he suggests. Bear with me a second. Thank you, your courtesy. Okay. 1 minute. He is extremely interested that education is never to be objective, that all knowledge must be political. Okay, and just let me find this. I'm so sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay. Pardon me. He says the following: I have 9 precepts of how higher education should work. 1, education must be intrinsically linked to both politics and ideology. Its objective is ending oppression and supporting revolutionary struggle. Revolutionary struggle must be permanent. 2, education cannot be conducted apart from politics. 3, education must reinvent how students think, and we have to be creative about this, for we must use education to overthrow capitalism. 5, learning is not for its own sake ever in liberation. It is a building of a society for everyone, requiring training in agitation and propaganda. And again, he says you cannot have education without also activism in the classroom as a part of ideology, with no opposition to what is being told. He goes on, teaching and agitation ought to be linked to propaganda, for it provides exactly what the masses actually want: simple phrases that they can repeat to each other. And there we go. Zionism equals racism. Israel is the reincarnation of Nazis. Teaching and agitation must not only be linked to propaganda, but the army of teachers must form an army of dedicated socialist teachers. And lastly, old ways of thinking are not easily removed, and it will take academics to organize for the state in a revolution. And I found that particularly important. And when I linked it to one more element, it is his theory of revolutionary language, which he says is essential for the revolution to succeed in higher education. And let me get to that. Yipes. Okay. And again, he says the following: revolution is a permanent war. And part of that permanent war is not only political, it is the use of language as a weapon. The language of a weapon, he says, must do the following: it must be articulate, it must allow no other opposition view to ever be stated, it must close down and define as illegitimate all other opposing views. That is written in the 1917 period, and it helps us to understand how, unfortunately, education at higher levels at the university can be used. So let's take a look at what he did, and what, most of all, what Stalin did. He says the following, is that, okay, 1 second. In addition to revolutionary tools, the only reason for education is to develop very important specialists that serve the needs of the state. And those professionals, after the revolution, did not exist in the Soviet Union. And so we have to set up a new way of developing education in which specialists who are not from the Tsarist period and who are not bourgeois, we have to create a new intelligentsia, or what is now called the new Soviet man. And the new Soviet man has to be a person that is devoid, as we're going to see, of everything that defines a Jew, of everything that defines a Jewish community. And this is what he says about language. The purpose of language in the classroom and speaking to the masses is to annihilate, to wipe out, to harm opposing views. Certain basic terms must come to penetrate the popular mainstream idiom, and they have made a profound impression upon largely uncritical masses. Think of these words that I am giving you that can be used permanently. Attack someone as a racist. Attack someone as a fascist. Attack someone as promoting genocide. The slogans, again, need to be very small, no more than from three words. He goes on to say that in order for me to have a revolutionary impact, I must go forward and build a new system, and he does. He creates in 1921 a system of higher education, and it is referred to as the Red Professors Institute, in which, with indoctrination of the professors, they will be the teachers of the new students that we will have in the new society. And he goes on and he says the following: I will be creating 3 institutions to start with. And he says openly that all other forms of education must be shut down that do not square with the revolutionary purpose. And he proceeds exactly like that. Okay, 1 second. I have so many papers here. He says, I will begin with asking a question. Who defines Jews and who defines Jewishness? And he goes on to say, whoever defines the Jews has to think of what do you want their rights to be? What do you want their behaviors to be? What do you want their professional obligations to be? And he says, the only way the Jews can survive is if they are assimilated into the radical framework, which over time they will emerge as pure Russian, and there will be no more Jews. There will be no more Jewish institutions. And he says, during nation building, institutions that were preserving Jewish identity are absolutely reactionary, and they must be liquidated. They were eventually replaced with Russified secular conceptualization of an identity that results in the intellectual and cultural genocide of Soviet Jewry and the killing of Jewish specificity and particularism. And driving the undermining is, he says, the importance of Jews living through the lens of Marxist-Leninism. Because I ask them, you insist, many of you as Zionists, that the Jews are a people, that the Jews are a nation. And he and Stalin say together, no, the Jews are not a nation, or a people. He's setting the framework up for the notion in contemporary ideology of Israel is illegitimate. Jews are not a people. The formation of Israel is a sinful act by people who claim to be a nation and are not. And he says, in order to be a nation, you must have territory. In order to be a nation, you must have a unique economy. In order to be a nation, you must have a collective language that is used uniformly. And there has to be something called a Jewish history. And he says, and especially Stalin develops further, that the Jews are not a nation. At best, they are an ethnic group, and as an ethnic group, they will not be entitled to the resources available that the national peoples of Russia are. And this becomes a very important element in using education as a system of social control. Soviet higher education was used to control, define, demonize, delegitimize Judaism, Zionism, and Israel. The administration of higher education was done by one force, Soviet Communist Party. It had a traumatic impact on the education and Jewish identity of Soviet Jewish students and faculty. It was the Communist Party that not only controlled all of higher education, but they controlled who gets into the universities. They controlled who passes a dissertation. They controlled what courses will be taught. And none of them had expertise in education. And so, again, what he is saying is that the Jews externally need to be defined. In fact, if you ask the question, who defines the Jew? His answer is, it cannot be the Jews. For if the Jews define what they are defining themselves incorrectly. How much more time do I have, please?
You should have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I would like to turn to what Stalin does, and it's extremely powerful. Lenin sets the framework for removing professional autonomy from all professions in the Soviet Union. He says it is not in the interest of the state for professionals to have professional autonomy. He sought more control over professional organizations, and his last years in power, he sets out to redefine what an intellectual is, who would be one, what role intellectuals would play, and what could engage in public spheres, according to him. According to Stuart Finkel, any attempt to define the role in society of their tasks within its independent collective dictum, any attempt to articulate thoughts that are not defined by the state and the party, are to be prohibited. Professors, physicians, and engineers fiercely resisted this program, arguing that scholarship and professionalism are apolitical. Lenin disagrees. The very term apolitical or non-political is hypocrisy. Education, Lenin says, had to be connected to the politics of the state. You have to understand the job of educators is to make sure that alien ideas, that is non-Soviet ideologies, have no access to corrupt the mentality of university students who are tomorrow's leaders. And similarly, threatening to Lenin were liberal journalists, philosophers, literary intelligentsia. He accused them of being nothing more than an ideological facade of a genuine Soviet revolution. And what we find is that Stalin went way beyond that. In turning from Lenin to Stalin, we can look at the crucial dynamics that ushered in one of the most devastating periods for Soviet Jews and consider the centrality of the ideological underpinnings that higher education in the Soviet Union provided. Rather than being committed to the eradication of anti-Semitism, or to realize an international proletariat socialist revolution, Stalin intensifies anti-Semitism, he normalizes it and promotes it to preserve his authority and that of the Communist Party. He distances himself from Lenin, and Stalin adopts a policy of actively abstaining from any and all efforts to combat anti-Semitism. He promotes and supports the publication and dissemination of anti-Semitic propaganda containing very dangerous anti-Jewish tropes, all of them based on the protocols of the elders of Zion. He reverses the professional opportunities that Jews received following the Bolshevik Revolution. And he bars Jews from high-level positions in the Communist Party. He bars them from academic positions in the best universities. He bars them from foreign service, the armed services, secret police, trade opportunities. For the primary structure of higher education is, he says, with regard to the Jews, is a system of social control. So what would become known as Stalinism involves a radical departure from Lenin's ideological conception of education, of language, and of activism. And Stalin reverts to a chauvinistic nationalism reminiscent of Tsarism, which glorifies Russia and its national past. This became a core element of life in the Soviet Union and was labeled, according to Stalin, patriotism, and the opposite of patriotism he refers to as cosmopolitanism. And at the same time, expressions of nationalist sentiment on the part of other groups in the Soviet Union, he also brands as deviationist, unpatriotic, and a threat to the stability of the state. This, of course, would legitimize future anti-Zionist campaigns. Stalin creates a party state that is an institution based on fear and a cult of personality. And it was one of the most dangerous totalitarian regimes to emerge following World War II. For him, any idea that is not legitimized by the state and the Communist Party is defined as foreign, alien, dangerous to the stability and the viability of the state. And thus he comes to view Jews through the same lens as foreign, alien, disloyal, rootless, greedy, lustful, part of the international Jewish cabal that aimed to dominate the world and overthrow the Soviet Union. His personal hatred of the Jews is very, very much studied as well. What I would like to look at in the closing few minutes is what he does in terms of ensuring that Jews cannot succeed at the highest levels of higher education. Between 1936 and 38, Stalin concretizes his conception of the new Soviet regime and the ideology in the publication of the short course, which became a primer and a catechism on Stalinism that served party leaders for decades. As the official mandatory blueprint for promoting issues and resolving conflicts, one had to follow the short course. And here we find that it includes the following: The Communist Party of Russia assumes responsibility in the future for guiding all higher education scholarship, all the literary arts to reflect ideology and propaganda. Second, he states, it is the requirement of an identifiable party line on all cultural and educational questions, thereby excluding the possibility of a fundamental debate within intellectual and cultural professions. The one-party state rejected even concepts pertaining to professional autonomy and academic freedom. In sum, Stalinism imposed total control and derived academic and cultural institutions into a box through the lens of Marxist-Leninism. And what we find is an enormous amount of studies of how he worked to limit the success and entry into a full life for the Jews. One, he uses discrimination. A portrait of the entrance exams to Soviet state universities reflect what he did specifically and only to Jews. According to the research of Eganoff, Shen, Frankel, and Belinsky, the general procedure for admission to a Soviet state university for students majoring in math consisted of a written and oral exam. The written portion of the exam consisted of a few simple problems demonstrating computational accuracy and a few more questions to test mathematical knowledge. According to Shen, only perfect papers were counted and allowed to advance to the orals. For non-Jewish students reaching their oral exams, they entered a different room and they were asked to choose two problems, and they were given a pencil and a paper to prepare the answers. And upon completion, the examiner would check the solutions, evaluate it, and follow up with one or two questions for the student. The student, if they weren't Jewish, would then be dismissed. But in the Jewish room, the examinations were entirely different for Jewish students. The oral exam could last as long as 5.5 hours. Students were given follow-up problems, one after another, until they failed in one small way on one of them. They were not asked to solve two problems, but usually 8 to 10. The system of examination intensified in 1947 when Stalin operationalized the quota system in higher education. Soviet Jewish students, faculty, and professional workers for whom education was the major vehicle for social mobility, economic stability, and professionalism were harmed. Stalin placed limitations on higher education opportunities by implementing a decision initiated by the Organization Bureau of the Central Committee, who disapproved of the way that Jews crowded out real Russians. And this impacted the distribution and employment in science and in all other fields. Based on complaints of the so-called overrepresentation of Jews in the professions, especially math and science, examinations were to be conducted of the ethnic composition of personnel in a large number of higher education institutions. These included the social sciences, political science department of prestigious institutions, including the Institute of Economics of the Academy of Science, all of Moscow University, and the Union of Composers, the staff of the Philharmonic, the ministries of autos, tractors, and aviation. And the sharpest reduction in the proportion of Jewish students occurred in the most prestigious institutions after the survey was taken. Examinations became one of the primary instruments, together with what was called the fifth point. And the fifth point, as you all know, is that on the official documents that a Jew had, it would say Ivri. If they came from a town in which they happened to be Jewish, but also a member of that town. They were known only by the word Ivri. And so what we find here is in the research, especially of DeWitt and Konstantinov, this became such an important issue that it reached the United States Congress, in which very important friends of the United States and Israel began to have hearings after hearings of how this was harming the Jewish community. As a result of this, it opened the door eventually to the legislation which assisted, and it took many, many years, of Jews to be able to emigrate. But what happened in the interim was Jews were fired for studying foreign countries, foreign literature, languages that were deemed suspect to the state, writing or saying disparaging remarks, being accused of being bourgeois, accused of being liberal positivists. And as a result of this, in a breathtaking study of Benjamin Tromley, one of the leading experts of the Stalin period in higher education, hundreds of great scholars were slandered, they were destroyed, their professional lives were harmed, and 4 major heads of departments were targeted and fired, including the chairs of anthropology and 2 chairs of Russian literature. The result of this was called an intellectual pogrom. And it was not only silencing scholars, but also it removed every footnote of books and lectures from all libraries in the Soviet Union, making these academics non-persons. I think I run out of time, but what I would like to conclude on is, just as we are studying the role of higher education in the United States in an alarming way of ideological imposition of faculty views on the student, I think we get so much insight into how in Russia the Stalinists and Leninists set the stage for much of what we are experiencing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Izabella, for the lectures. We're now going to open it up to questions. If you'd like to directly...
I'm sorry.
Sorry? Oh, okay.
No, do your intro. I wanted to just say something. I'm sorry.
Just 1 second. Thank you. Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand and I'll call up your name. Jay, if you want to ask a question, I'll just give the floor to Daniel, who raised his hand, and then I'll get back to you right after, okay?
Of course.
Daniel, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Izabella and Ellen. I have 2 comments. One is a genuine comment, and another is a suggestion, perhaps. I must say that I wish to thank you both for this presentation, and I would say that in the broader field of a study of contemporary anti-Zionism, perhaps modern anti-Semitism, what you presented as much under-researched topic, as a much resisted topic in academia. And perhaps ISGAP, I'm talking factually, is probably the only place where I could see these points raised and sufficient time given to them. And when I live in Britain at the moment, and when I came here in 2005, for the first time in my life, I was started to pay attention to the local press. And I said to a colleague of mine, who is a professor of sociology in Budapest, that if I took an editorial of The Guardian, British Guardian, translated it to Russian, sent it to him and said that something like this I found in an archive. Look at what I found in an archive. It's an editorial from Pravda, 1972, let's say, or maybe 67. He wouldn't even suspect a fraud. you can actually take this content from The Guardian and present it as a genuine Soviet contribution to intellectual in an intellectual domain. Now, I can see you agreeing mildly with this, and surprisingly, this very thought, this very joke, you could say, is something that creates an incredible resistance when I voice it in the environment of, I'd say, Jewish academics or people who are experts in the study of contemporary Jewish history. It is a much hated point, which brings me to the next comment.
Daniel, let's
there's a significant.
Short. Yeah. We have Daniel. Okay. We don't have a lot of time for questions.
Yeah, I'll draw a line here. I would only say that the role of Jewish intellectuals themselves in creating a contemporary version of anti-Zionism with Soviet contribution is another topic. If one of you is looking for an inspiration for a book or a topic for a PhD, that would be that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll be shorter. Great job, ladies. Both of you mentioned the Protocols of Elders of Zion, and folks need to know that it was a forged document from Tsarist time. It was before the Bolshevik Revolution, and part of the Protocols of Zion had to do with the old age trope about Jews controlling money. And at the time, it got a lot of ink because you had the Rothschild family. You had one brother in England, you had another brother in France, and there was another brother in Austria-Hungary, maybe. So it kind of fed into the whole trope about Jews with money because, again, you had the Rothschild family that were, controlling banks at the time. That's my point.
Okay, great. And Lawrence first had his hand up. You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah,
You're muted.
Thank you for the. No, I'm unmuted now. I wanted to thank you for the two great lectures. I learned a lot. My question is, I hope not irrelevant. I would like to know what connections can be made between the Soviet anti-Zionism you talked about and the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism of the Islamist ideology we are witnessing now.
Well, I can say a couple of words in terms of what I have seen. So I'm not an expert on Islamist and Islamic and Arab anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I don't know Arabic, but here's what I've seen. For example, some of the ideologists, the ideologues who actually produced Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. It's very interesting. It was a small group. It was maybe, 12.5 individuals who we now know a lot more about than we would have, 50 years ago at the time. But several of the most prominent of them were Arabists by training. They knew Arabic perfectly. They spent time in Arab countries as part of Soviet embassies. One of them, for example, was in Egypt at the time when Egyptian anti-Zionist propaganda was run by a former Nazi. And so we know also that this person that I'm talking about now, Yevgeny Yevseyev, that he quoted he used some ideas that during the Cold War already people traced to some of the brochures that were put out by that Egyptian institute. So I think that probably what happened is that he went there, he made contacts. I think he came across these publications, he brought them back, and then he used them in his own writings. And then I think the path, it was kind of the mutual, the feedback loop was there. So I think that the Soviets, I'm sure that they used ideas, they kind of vacuumed up ideas that came from different directions. They didn't necessarily invent everything. You can tell that they, like when I look at some of the stuff that they put out, it's obvious to me that like they read Hannah Arendt, they read the Western left, and they would and they read Herzl, by the way, they read all of the Zionist founders, and they would pick out quotes that served them, they would decontextualize them and use them in their own kind of in constructing their own narratives, and then they would pump it all back out into the world, right? So ideas that might not have received any attention or much global audience would suddenly get really amplified in multiple languages. Mm-hmm. So I think that with the Arab countries and the Arab anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think it likely worked both ways, that the Soviets may have borrowed from them, and then, pumped the ideas back to them. They certainly were very much in touch with them over the Palestinian question. So it's a loop that really needs to be studied. I often say that to really understand this, and this is to Daniel Stajewski's point, to research this fully, we actually need multiple scholars who are proficient in multiple languages, because, like I've done a lot of research in English and Russian, but you have to look at it in Arabic, in Spanish, and French, and German, and all of the major languages in order to really make all of the connections and to understand. But like in the English language word, I can see how some of the leftist publications that were put out, in the UK, in the US, in South Africa, you can see that it's the same ideas. You can see that it's the source is the same, because they're all connected to Moscow, and so the same ideas are being pumped out to the entire English-speaking world, and we really need to do it in all languages that are out there.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Izabella.
Ellen, do you want to comment?
I'm having a hard time hearing. I was able to hear Izabella, but I wasn't able to hear Ms. Brust. So I'm terribly sorry.
Okay, well, we'll hope. Please speak closer to the camera, everybody, when you ask the question. John, I'll get to you in a second. I'll just get Amy to ask her question first.
Thank you. This question is for Professor Kennan. I'm reluctant to do this to you because this is a common question, and it's a question of what is to be done with an eye to the fact that it seems that our professional organizations have been taken over and our administrations are really quite hostile to us. So I'm wondering what it is that you think would be an effective strategy to countering what's going on college campuses today.
Right. Thank you very, very much. Wonderful Amy Ellman. If any of you are not aware, Amy is one of our foremost scholars and a dear friend to both Izabella and me. And we both, I can speak for her on this, we cherish you. Thank you for the question. Things are as difficult as they have ever been. I'll give you an example that happened to me yesterday. I have approached the DEI person, the person in charge of equity and diversity and inclusion at my university, trying to, again, have an opening to include anti-Semitism as one of the things that a university has to address. That has not happened yet. However, because of October 7th, there has been an outpouring of pro-Palestinian support at my university, rallies of every kind, and they're pretty much continuous. And all of a sudden yesterday, I get a email from the DEI office that there will be a event about Islamophobia and about anti-Semitism. Well, when my family picked me off the floor, because I was so shocked that this may be the first one, myself and the coordinator of Jewish studies, we immediately checked who was the speaker, and she was one of the founding members of JVP. So I immediately, and JVP is Jewish Voice for Peace, and they are extremely anti-Zionist, and part of their physicality is to disrupt efforts when Jews are organizing lectures or rallies. And I just could not believe this. However, because of everything at the university, I contacted a wonderful member of my department, and I explained to them that I am officially now frightened about what is going on at school, and I'm feeling for the first time in my life very, very uncomfortable and scared. And when I tried to explain to him what the JVP was, and he said to me, he's a lovely, well-read person. He said, well, they're for peace, no? Because they had the word peace. So I didn't even know where to begin. And I called immediately Miriam Ellman, the executive director of AEN, the Academic Engagement Network, who is an unbelievable visionary of what academics need across the country in every discipline, in addition to support. And she provided me with material that I'm going to be able to use. She answered me within 2 minutes of how I can help you and the letters that need to be written. I contacted American Jewish Committee. Within 5 minutes, I was heard from by them, and they said, we are now setting up a meeting, and we would like you to be the person that is the conduit between us. That's the one thing I think is very important. It's just like Charles said, you fight back. This is no time to quiver. We have got to keep going because, one, besides our future and the well-being of the Jewish community and Israel, democracy is very fragile right now. And if it continues in this direction of fabrication and false information, it's truly not going in the right direction. The second thing, I think, is that the more information we have reported, resulting in data, resulting in really saving every piece as evidence and accumulating them, I think that we are moving for more legal efforts than we have in the past. And I think that is where we're going. The most important thing is right now to keep publishing about what is going on. And I totally so appreciate Daniel's comment. When we try to speak to other academics, they don't want to hear this. They really think that it's something, a defect in us, that we are experiencing this. And most of all, they end by saying, how the hell could you support Israel and their murderers? You know, what do you say to that? What do you say to that? You know, like it's time for a Knish war? What am I supposed to do? So the interesting thing is that we have to understand this is a battle for the minds and hearts of the future of this country. And we cannot be silent. We have to publish, we have to be on radio, we have to be on television. We have to now, ISGAP, for example, has an hourly show, a wonderful hourly show on the Jewish television network, and it's terrific. And last week they had 2 students on. They were marvelous from the law school of Columbia University as to what they're faced with. It was very, very upsetting to hear. But my answer is, I am exhausted, and this is no time to sit down. I am at this nearly 50 years. I have never experienced anything like this, and it is very serious. And we have to just keep on going in this direction and support each other. And I can't thank enough everybody who came to this lecture and just spent time with us, because it again legitimates the effort of ISGAP and the effort of academics to take us in a way that hopefully can make a difference.
Izabella, do you want to add a comment?
I mean, I agree with absolutely everything that Ellen just said in terms of, oh, wait, can you see it and hear me? Okay, sorry,
Yeah.
I just... Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, from the point about having to do it to the point of being exhausted and yet having to and needing to keep doing it, because if there are some who don't want to hear us, it's okay. There are plenty of others who do want to hear and who are receptive to it. And I think that we need to really focus our efforts not on de-radicalizing the ones who are unde-radicalizable, who will need to be de-radicalized through special processes. These we can't change their minds, but there are plenty of people whose minds are not yet made up, or who maybe think like us. And I think it's what's really important, and it's been my message the last 6 weeks every time I speak, is that we really need to stop dividing ourselves even more than we're already divided. We know that so often, before all of this happened, liberal Jews will not, reach across the aisle to conservative Jews. We have to end this. This is the center against the radicals, the center against the extremes. We have to realize it, and we have to work together at this point.
Thank you.
One more thing that I want to stress, that your local representatives at the city level, at the state level, and at the national level, they need to hear from you regularly. Recently, I know that Izabella attended the Conference of Mayors. You can't have a more receptive group. And when we look at the support that we've gotten from mayors of small towns, medium towns, big towns, it matters. It is.
I agree.
So we have to also not give up on the political system when it is so dysfunctional right now. We still have to find those pockets that can support our fight for naming and labeling anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Oh, and let's see. Amy just wrote that. Amy, want to tell us what you just wrote? It disappeared.
Yes, I want to second what you just said. Even at the city level, following swastikas planted on our Chabad Center 2 blocks from the college campus on Shabbos, the Kalamazoo City Commission has just passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. And the guy that they think is a suspect is now posted online by the police department. So yes, we've got to speak out, and even at the city level. Yep.
Yeah. Great.
We've essentially run out of time, but because Daniel waited because John waited for so long, Izabella and Ellen, if you don't mind.
Oh, so happy.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
John, I'll give you the floor for the last question.
Thank you very much. John Suarez, Center for Free Cuba. My question is, when I've looked at the history, it seems to me that the quote-unquote original sin of Israel is that in 1948, when the U.S. had an arms embargo on the Middle East, the country that provided arms to Israel when the surrounding Arab states attacked was the Soviet Union.
That's right.
And it seems that because Israel did not join the Soviet bloc, that is the unforgivable sin, and that's what has spurned this anti-Soviet campaign against Israel. I just wanted to see if you could confirm that for me. Thank you.
Oh, Izabella, anything?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's what certainly triggered the initial paranoia of Stalin's. There were a few events that he realized that, things are not. The USSR, of course, supported the establishment of Israel. But yeah, absolutely. Once it became clear that it was taking a different route, that was a reason, But I think that, in 40, I don't know if it's the main unforgivable sin, because I think at this point there are so many that nobody can really point to just a single one of them. And I think that, again, I look at 67 as really the turning point, when it almost doesn't matter anymore what Israel does or what it says. It's just viewed as the enemy. The Zionism is viewed as the main ideological enemy because it's viewed as being in cahoots with the United States and really undermining socialism and undermining national liberation movements. And that's when, once it becomes this kind of conspiracy theory, facts don't matter anymore. You can have, just like they say, you can have anti-Semitism without Jews. I think you can have anti-Zionism without Zionists. It doesn't matter anymore what Israelis do. It doesn't matter what Zionist Jews do. It's the conspiracy theory exists, and it will continue to exist. So I'm agreeing with you, and I also think I'm not sure if it's like the one and only one. I think that there are many others.
One of the John, thank you for the question. It's a very, very good question. One of the things that is really stunning is when, for several reasons, the Soviet Union is hoping that the new state of Israel will join that wing of nations and not go to the United States, Great Britain, and France. There is for the first time, the representative at the UN calls us a people. And when I read that, it is available in every history book. It was the first speech that said, yes, we will stand by. Yes, we will do what is necessary. You have suffered a great deal. And then he goes on to call us a people. Only a few years later, by the early 1950s, when they now are quite sure that Israel will stay in the Western camp, the UN ambassador makes a terribly powerful speech and says to the ambassador from Israel, I think it was something like Tekoa, he said to him, how could you be against racism when you are at a racist country? And Zionism is racism. So even before 1967, the notion of how do you delegitimize these people? How do you, and the issue of race is a hook. It is a huge hook. Look how it resonates in the United States. You could be a person that has done very bad things in your private and professional life. But if you are accused of being a racist, there's very little room to recover. And they found a vehicle to really slam dunk our community. And again, it's very, very, very interesting. But if you're interested, John, I think it is so wonderful to read the documents at the UN. They're all available online. All of us have access even to the Congressional Library and to ask librarians for help because, you know, facts are very interesting and it helps us, it just helps. It helps us stay a little bit more sane than otherwise. So that's a great question.
Thank you.
I think that is a great way to end our session today. I would like to thank Ellen and Izabella for being here. It's always an honor to host you, and it was very enlightening. And I hope we get to hear more from you both in the future and keep fighting the good fight.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for
Thanks
joining
for
us.
hosting, Daphne. Thanks for hosting.
Thank you,
Thank
Amy.
you.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Bye,
Great to be
everyone.
here.
Bye, folks.
Bye.